don't care about being popular, whatever. The first thing you got to do is you got to study and understand who you're up against. And you must realize that this is not a religion that you're fighting against. You're fighting against a theopolitical belief system and construct. You're fighting against something that's been doing this thing since 622 AD, 7th century, 1,388 years. You want to dig up Charles Martel and ask him why he was fighting the Muslim army at the Battle of Tours in 732. You want to ask the Venetian fleet at Lepanto why they were fighting a Muslim fleet in 1571. You want to ask the Christian, the Germanic and Austrian knights why they were fighting at the gates of Vienna in 1683. You want to ask people what happened at Constantinople and why today is called Istanbul, because they lost that fight in 1453. You need to get into the Quran. You need to understand their precepts. You need to read the Surah. You need to read the Hadiths. And then you can really understand this is not a perversion. They are doing exactly what this book says. Thank you so much, Jed, and thank you for having me, Dr. London. Thank you for the invite to be here. One thing I want to let everyone know, when you look at this panel, you have two contrasting personas here. You have the opportunity to see what happens when you take the flight test, and you pass the flight test, as General Myers did, and also Jed Babin. But you also have an example of when you fail the flight test, you get in the other line, which is for folks who just jump out of airplanes. So with that being said, that gives you an understanding of my level of intellect. One of the things we have to understand when we talk about the rules of engagement, we have to clearly recognize this 21st century battlefield. And the 21st century battlefield is totally different from what I grew up with starting off as a young lieutenant and going through the artillery basic school where they taught you about Soviet formations. And then you went out to the National Training Center in the Mojave Desert and you fought against these set-piece type formations. And of course my first tour of duty was in Vicenza, Italy, where I did tours and patrols against the Bulgarian border, against the Czech border. But when I went to Desert Storm in 1991, we fought an army that pretty much so applied those rules. I was in the 1st Infantry Division. We attacked them. We broke through their lines. We encircled them. We brought them to their knees in about 5 or 6 days. But when I went back to Iraq in 2003, it was a different type of enemy. It was a different type of battlefield. We had now become faced with an enemy that took off those uniforms and morphed themselves within the populace. And that made it a whole lot different for us being on the battlefield. And then when I went back again as a civilian military advisor for 2.5 years in Kandahar, Afghanistan, we saw that the whole thing about state-oriented military had broken down. Now what we're dealing with is non-state, non-uniform belligerents on the battlefield. We are truly dealing with what I call illegal enemy combatants. But yet we have rules of engagement right now that provide them an advantage, that provide them an initiative against our soldiers. Let me give you some examples of things that I have been involved in. When you get into a firefight, you got maybe about 5 seconds. And after 5 seconds, people are going to start to lose their lives. And if you have rules that are out there right now that are saying you can't engage until the enemy shows some type of hostile intent. We had a firefight not too long ago, last year, I believe in Nangarhar province, where we lost about 16 to 20 of our soldiers. It took approximately 1 hour to get reinforcing aircraft to come in because they continually asked them, can you verify that there will not be any collateral damage to civilians? When you're a commander of a company in a firefight, you don't have time to stick your head up and look and see, are there civilians out there? And not only that, they watched this enemy assemble themselves in the local village mosque, and they were not allowed to engage that enemy. Back when I was in Afghanistan, we had a firefight down in Kajiki Dam, and we put a lot of hurt on the Taliban forces. And what the Taliban did was to enable them to go back and retrieve their dead and wounded from the battlefield. They went into a local village, and they got children. And they brought the children up, and they held them up close to them. And that is how they retrieved their dead and wounded. When the Canadian forces came down and started an operation in the fall of 2006, and the lower Kajiki area. The Taliban went into houses with women and children. And we continue to see that. I mean, one of the things we saw recently was the Haditha incident, where, of course, Congressman Murtha castigated our young Marines as wanton murderers. But when the enemy knows what the rules that you apply to yourself, he uses that as a gap by which he exploits you. How many have had the opportunity to read the book by Navy SEAL Marcus Luttrell, Lone Survivor? And the interesting dilemma that they found themselves in, and I was there at the time in Afghanistan, Operation Red Wing back in 2005. Their mission had been compromised. And instead of following the normal SEAL special operative protocols, they decided within themselves to let those Afghan goat herders go. And those people, in turn, went to the local Taliban. And all of a sudden, you had upwards of about 100 come down on a SEAL team of about 4 individuals. They were able to call in to get a reinforcing team to come in, but if you recall, that Chinook helicopter was shot down. Because they were more so afraid of being prosecuted by our own legal system, as Andrew talked about here, we lost 19 of our most highly trained special operators that day in Afghanistan in 2005. Now, what must we do with our rules of engagement? First thing, it comes back to something that Sun Tzu always talked about. You have to know your enemy and know yourself and know the terrain. And in countless amounts of battles, you will always be victorious. We still have a problem clearly defining who this enemy is. You know, we called it a war on terror. Well, a nation does not go to war against a tactic. Now we call it an overseas contingency operation. Well, there were times when I went overseas for missions that was not war. If we are going to have the right and proper rules of engagement, we have to understand who is on that battlefield. We have to understand these non-state, non-uniform belligerents. We have to understand that we're fighting against an Islamic totalitarianism and state-sponsored terrorism. The key thing that we must do with our rules of engagement, there has to be a bottom-up refinement. Because who best knows what's going on the ground than the people who are on the ground? When we start to have this top-driven rule of engagement, you are indeed, Jed, putting our young men and women in a very bad situation. See, if you're out in the middle of the night on a road in Afghanistan and Iraq, and you got a shovel, you got a wheelbarrow, and you got a couple of oblong-looking devices with wires coming out of it, I don't think you're out there planting fruit. But yet, our young men and women have to ask for clearance. Look at any of these Apache gun tapes, and you will hear the pilots calling back and asking to engage when they have eyes on that target and they clearly know what is happening. Same thing happened pretty much so back early in 2005 when a UAV operator had what was believed to be a convoy with Osama bin Laden going down the Jalalabad Road out of Kabul. And because of the delay in getting the clearance, he was able to get over into Pakistan. We have got to get this user-friendly down to the men and women on the battlefield. And one key thing is political correctness cannot dictate rules of engagement. Now, another thing